Ava Bennett had never imagined that the man who had manipulated his way into marrying her would perish in a blast while attempting to rescue her from kidnapping. As I bled out on the cold concrete, I managed to whisper to her, "If there's another life after this, I pray I never cross your path again." Ava cradled my bloodied frame and wept without restraint, for she had spent more than a decade despising me. Yet when the threat came, I was the only person who had laid down his life for her. Only in that moment did she understand that her love for me had long since taken root in her soul, though she had been too afraid to acknowledge it. So she grabbed what was left of the explosives and struck the match, crying out, "James, I am on my way to make things right." There was a roar of white light, and when her eyes fluttered open again, she was back on the very night she had been slipped something in her drink long ago. In that previous existence, Ava and I had ended up in bed together, only for her stepsister to barge in with a crowd of onlookers. She had been on the verge of tying the knot with her first love, but after the public fallout, she was compelled to marry me against her will. Ava was convinced I had orchestrated the whole affair, so she harbored that resentment for years, and for all 10 years of our marriage, we brought nothing but misery to one another. Ava had wished over and over to go back to that critical moment, yet now that she truly had, there was no happiness in her heart. She finally knew the truth, for it had been her stepsister, Isabella, who had slipped her the drug, and at that instant, the door groaned on its hinges. A heavy-set man shuffled closer, his laughter greasy as he told her he was here for his little beauty, and the sound of his voice made Ava's blood run cold. It was not James, which meant this must be the man Isabella had originally intended for her, though in her former life, she had already faded into unconsciousness by then and had no idea what had actually transpired. All she knew was that she had wound up with James instead. "I never dreamed I would be this lucky," the man grumbled under his breath as he crept forward, eager for a taste of a high-society girl. Struggling against a surge of disgust, Ava scrabbled across the coffee table for anything she could throw and launched it at his head. The man sidestepped her projectiles with a chuckle, rubbing his palms in anticipation as he closed in on the couch, telling her she might as well give up because nobody was coming to rescue her. His sweaty fingers stretched toward her, and Ava snatched the final cup from the table, hurling it at his outstretched hand, only for him to bat it aside, as if it were nothing. The cup exploded against the floor, and the man's smirk only widened as he taunted her about having nothing left to throw, a comment that sent a wave of hopelessness crashing through Ava's chest. I stepped in and ground my heel into his wrist until I heard that awful, splintering crack, ensuring his hand was shattered for certain. Across the room, the instant Ava spotted me, something in her snapped, and she hurled herself at me, clutching at my jacket. Once I had someone haul that creep away, I shrugged off my jacket, draped it over Ava's shoulders, and lifted her out of that place. In my former life, it was in that same room that I had rescued Ava, but when confronted with the girl I adored, I had given in to my worst instincts, and the shame of it had haunted me ever since. Looking back now, though, there must have been something in the air, some kind of incense clouding my judgment, because I had not been in full control of my senses that night either. With that realization, I carried Ava to my car and drove to the closest hotel, where I trapped her thrashing wrists and pressed her close to contain her frenzy. Her cheeks were burning scarlet, and I felt a hot sweat break out on my own skin, so I spun around and forced myself to inhale slowly because I could not stand to keep staring at her. "Ava, in this life, I am setting you free," I whispered. "Every disaster began right here, so this is where we make it right." At the Grand Astoria, in a luxury suite, I pushed the door open, laid the girl in my arms onto the mattress, and immediately summoned a physician. Then Ava's hands started roaming restlessly as she whimpered that she was burning up, calling my name, and for a heartbeat, I was certain my ears were deceiving me. Yet when I drew nearer to the bed, I heard it clearly, as she was crying out for me again and again while her thoughts were reduced to chaos. She tore at her own clothing in a frenzy, needing any relief from the inferno inside her, until her blazing fingers encountered something chilled and she latched onto it for dear life. But that cold object attempted to retreat, causing Ava to panic and entwine her limbs around it, plastering her entire frame against me as she begged me not to go. I stared at the girl wrapped around me like a serpent, and without a single instant of doubt, I wrenched her free and dropped her back onto the mattress. In my former life, witnessing her in that state would have made it impossible for me to hold back. Yet now, I simply turned my gaze away and retreated a full 2 paces. Recalling the icy, pitiless look she had worn throughout our previous existence, I drew a long breath and steeled myself, telling my heart to leave her alone because she only harbors contempt. Ava, in this lifetime, we are strangers, and we will remain that way, I told myself, vowing there would be no ties and no future encounters. Yet the moment I met Ava's gaze, I turned to stone, for in my former life, those same eyes had ensnared my very being from the instant I first looked into them. From that day forward, she had consumed my waking thoughts, and I had desired no other woman, so I warned myself not to be captured by her gaze a second time. I compelled my brain to conjure that frosty, detached stare she had directed at me without fail for an entire decade, using it as a shield to keep my guard up. A short while after, the doorbell chimed, so I jolted back to reality and drew the sheets over Ava before letting in the physician, a brilliant woman with a doctorate from Stanford who served the Harrison family. She was exceptionally skilled and soon stabilized Ava's condition, and once I had seen the doctor out, the suite fell into a heavy silence. Ava rested serenely on the bed with the feverish color drained from her face, and since she was striking even in repose, I sat on the sofa and watched her for a long while. The following morning, Ava's eyes snapped wide as she bolted upright, every detail of her past life flooding back to her now that she had returned to the night she was drugged. Her skull throbbed, so she pressed her palms to her temples and sank against the headboard, noting that she was still wearing the same clothes from the night before. Although they were wrinkled, she was positive that nothing intimate had occurred, as her skin bore no marks and she felt no unusual sensations. In her previous existence, she had awakened with her entire body aching and her flesh littered with the evidence of my passion. A hotel? Why am I in a hotel? This is nothing like before, she thought, recalling with absolute clarity that the final face she had seen was mine. While Ava struggled to assemble the puzzle, my voice sliced into her ruminations as I noted she was awake, making her jerk the blanket to her chin with a guarded look. Though I had resolved to keep my distance, that guarded expression in her eyes still cut deep. But the instant Ava recognized me, her rigid shoulders dropped in confusion. "You and I," she stammered, questioning why things were so different and asking if she had somehow slipped into an alternate reality. As Ava's imagination spun through outlandish scenarios, I observed her with composure and assured her that I never laid a hand on her, having called a physician instead. My statement left Ava paralyzed because it made no sense to her why I had refrained, and as she searched my features, the man from her future merged with the one standing there. Her silence unsettled me, for she was far too composed, and aside from a brief flash of alarm, she had remained utterly still. In our former life, when that room had been thrown open, she had awakened in a frantic, shattered state, her glare seething with pure loathing for me. Although nothing had transpired this time, her tranquility was deeply disturbing, but I had no intention of becoming entangled with her in this existence again. A single night was enough, so I told her I would not trouble her further and that our shared story terminated here. My final words from my deathbed rang in her memory, and as the realization struck her, she lurched from the mattress and seized my arm before I could reach the door. "James, you returned as well, did you not?" she asked, and as my gaze snapped wide in comprehension, she lunged into my embrace with tears saturating my shirt. She called me a fool for dying alongside her and thanked God for this second chance, promising that she would treat me well and grant me whatever I desired. I gazed down at the girl, clinging to me with my feelings in complete disarray, stunned that we had both been reborn into this life. In our former life, I had employed every scheme imaginable to claim her as my wife, Yet she had responded with a decade of total, icy silence. That decade of indifference still caused a dull ache in my chest, but I could not bring myself to blame her because I was the architect of my own suffering. I had been the one to stop at nothing to win her, and I had borne the agony of that decision. But now we each possessed the freedom to select a different path. I shut my eyes for an instant before softly disengaging from her, telling her that in this life, she was free to love whomever she chose, and that our story terminated here. My statement froze her in place, and she shook her head in desperation as she clutched my fingers and begged me not to abandon her. I stared at our intertwined hands and withdrew mine, asking her if she had any concept of the agony I had endured loving her, an agony that had left me with no trust and no optimism for a future together. Ava stared forlornly at her empty hand and asked for one final opportunity, but I told her that the pain was simply too much and that she had to release me. I pivoted and strode off, steeling my heart and refusing to glance behind, while she collapsed to the ground in a tight sphere of silent sobs. She felt utterly solitary, realizing that the man who had adored her for more than 10 years genuinely no longer desired her. Ava wept until her energy was spent, eventually sinking into a heavy slumber where she dreamed of the version of me who had perpetually trailed after her. Yet upon awakening, the vacant hotel suite only mirrored the hollow feeling in her chest, so she brushed away her tears and focused on the truth. She knew the rift between us had originated with that trap, and since Isabella was the mastermind, Ava headed home to settle the score. At Scarsdale Estates, an exclusive community just outside Manhattan, Ava rapped on the front door with a somber expression. Inside, Isabella and Leo were absorbed in a video game while Noah Bennett scrolled through his phone and interjected into their chatter. Mrs. Bennett was in the kitchen directing the housekeeper to prepare all of Isabella and the boys' favorite dishes to celebrate her husband's return. Ava slipped into her house shoes at the foyer and absorbed those words in quiet, for she was accustomed to being overlooked by her mother, even if it still hurt. Her mother could recall the preferred meals of every other person in the household, yet she never once remembered what Ava enjoyed. Then Mrs. Bennett added that the DeVises and Ryan would be joining them for dinner, necessitating even more special courses for the visitors. At the mention of Ryan, Ava went rigid, recalling how the disillusionment on his face had carved through her like a blade in her former existence. The Davis family had once favored Ava for a marital union, but after observing that orchestrated disgrace, his mother had been filled with pure revulsion. She never brought up the pairing again, and the arrangement pivoted to Isabella, who eventually wed Ryan and shared a life of apparent bliss. Each holiday when I escorted Ava to the Bennett residence, we would inevitably cross paths with them, and witnessing their happiness always stirred a pang of jealousy in her chest. Returning to the moment, she walked into the living room as an invisible ghost, whereas in her old life, she would have labored in the kitchen to win her mother's approval. She had not realized then that certain individuals are simply fated to go unloved, and that no volume of striving can alter that fact. This time, she disregarded everyone and ascended to her bedroom to call her academic advisor, intending to transfer her records and sever every legal connection to the household. When the meal was ready, she descended to find the others in high spirits, but the instant she entered the room, every voice fell into an awkward silence. Mrs. Bennett blinked in surprise and remarked that she had not noticed her arrive, assuming she had been occupied with chores in the kitchen. Ava did not step forward to wait on anyone, and since the scandal had not occurred, Mrs. Davis remained cordial and viewed her as a potential daughter-in-law. She welcomed Ava home and urged her to eat, noting that university had made her appear slimmer. Staring at the woman's bright expression, Ava could only recall that gaze of pure disdain from her former existence, and she found she could not simply brush the memory aside. Ava offered a courteous hello before selecting a chair at the far end of the table and commencing her meal without a word. Mrs. Davis observed this and playfully asked if she and Ryan had become strangers since she was seated so far away. At that remark, Ava lifted her gaze and locked eyes with Ryan, a move that made Isabella's expression curdle with immediate jealousy. Observing Ava looking perfectly well, Isabella was baffled as to how her trap had failed and who she had actually been with. She inquired in a honeyed tone about where Ava had stayed the night before, a question that made Mrs. Bennet frown and Mrs. Davis arch a curious eyebrow. Ava coolly surveyed every face around the table before delivering a seamless falsehood about staying at a female friend's residence after leaving the gathering early. Isabella was unconvinced because she knew Ava did not actually have any close companions, but Ava offered only evasive replies to the prying questions. She had no intention of exposing the truth, for she knew her family would never hold Isabella accountable and would only manufacture justifications for her actions. As Isabella persisted, Leo interjected with a mocking scoff, claiming she was likely out fooling around with some random man. "I am 20 years old, and I do not need to file a report with this household every time I visit a companion," Ava retorted, questioning what authority he had when he was out taking girls to motels. Leo recoiled in shock at her defiance, but when she threatened to display photographs of his behavior, his cheeks flushed scarlet. He tried to argue that stepping into a hotel did not imply impropriety and accused her of having a perverse imagination. Ava turned the blade deeper by asking why he was escorting a married woman to a hotel, a comment that caused every gaze in the room to swivel toward him. Leo's features contorted in alarm as he desperately called her a liar and tried to defame her character instead. Most of the family appeared to favor Leo's side, so Ava sprang to her feet and hurled a glass of water directly into his face. "Ava, have you lost your mind?" Leo shouted while sending his chair crashing backward, but she simply told him to rinse his foul tongue. She accused him of being repulsive for destroying another person's marriage, a claim he vehemently denied, while she recalled the husband who had once appeared at their door to scream the truth. Noah methodically dabbed his fingers with a napkin and asked her for evidence, reminding her that she should not level such allegations against her own brother. "And what evidence did he present for his accusations against me?" she challenged, leaving Noah mute as she told them to believe what they wanted and left the table. She knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came out, and while the others were stunned by her transformation, she no longer cared about their validation. With her eyes shut, she recalled how she had been forsaken during that staged abduction where the entire family had chosen to save Isabella instead of her. Isabella had been unbearable until the detonator failed and the warehouse exploded. Yet now Ava could feel her heart pumping strongly and knew she was truly alive. Every person harbors an obsession, and in my previous existence, mine was her, while hers was her family. This patchwork household consisted of her stepfather's son and the children her mother had borne him, leaving Ava as the mere consequence of her mother's earlier indiscretion. Ava had grown up in a children's home wishing for parents, until an elegantly attired woman arrived and declared that she was her mother. Mrs. Bennet had embraced her with tears of joy, proclaiming that she had at last located her long-lost daughter. The day she walked out of that orphanage had been the most joyful of her entire life. She arrived at the Bennet household brimming with optimism, and even the discovery that her father and brother were not biological relatives did not dampen her spirits. Possessing a mother and a real name like Ava Bennet was more than enough to make her happy. However, her new sister was not present because she was hospitalized, pallid, and completely bald from her illness. Mrs. Bennet eventually implored her to rescue Isabella, who required a bone marrow transplant to survive her leukemia. The 11-year-old Ava comprehended the situation immediately, yet she feigned ignorance and offered a courageous smile to soothe her mother's distress. On the day her sister was discharged, her mother beamed with a radiance that far surpassed the day she had reclaimed Ava, yet Ava was glad to see her family so joyful. Regrettably, the sister she had rescued grew bitter and envious, despising Ava for diverting even the smallest fraction of the family's focus. That wounded Ava deeply, for she only desired a modest measure of affection, yet she released a rueful chuckle at the memory of how she had been shackled to such a family. She bided her time until the house was empty of everyone but herself and Isabella, knowing her moment of reckoning had finally arrived. Ava packed her belongings and extracted her birth certificate from the family's legal records before proceeding to Isabella's chamber. Her sister was sprawled across her bed and did not even trouble herself to be polite as she demanded to know what Ava wanted. Recalling every injustice, Ava accused her of slipping the drug into her drink, but Isabella merely feigned ignorance and returned her focus to her screen. "You are fully aware of what I mean," Ava said as she snatched the device and dashed it against the floor, pinning her sister to the mattress. Isabella was powerless to resist as Ava demanded to know why she had betrayed the person who had saved her life years ago. Isabella shrieked for her to let go before a vicious grin curved across her lips as she realized Ava might have ended up with some worthless stranger. Before she could utter another word, Ava's palm descended with a resounding smack that left Isabella's cheek burning with impact. Ava shouted that she earned it as she struck the other cheek, recalling how this girl's malice had led to their deaths in another life. Isabella was in shock because no one had ever raised a hand against her, and she vowed that her brothers would make Ava suffer for this. Ava's eyes burned red as she rained blows upon Isabella, telling her that she no longer desired this family and that her sister was welcome to them. Isabella could not comprehend how the girl who had always craved their approval had suddenly become so detached and violent. Eventually, Isabella lost consciousness, and Ava released her with a quaking hand before marching out of the house for the last time. Before departing, she cast one final glance at the residence and offered a wordless farewell, accepting that she was once again a girl without a home. She flew back to Boston to resume her studies, and upon her return, she found herself drifting toward the spot where I had once made a grand public declaration of love. That day had been crowded with balloons and fireworks, but it had concluded in failure because she had turned me down. She had fled while I pursued, but in this existence, she had at last lost the young man who had perpetually trailed after her. Ava brushed a tear from her eye and scrolled through her phone to find her dorm information, realizing it had been so many years since she lived here. Her phone began to ring from an unknown number, and she answered only to hear Mrs. Bennett shrieking for her to return home and apologize for her actions. Ava ended the call without a word and blocked the number, having already done the same to every other member of the household. When Leo called from a different number to threaten her with crude insults, she waited for him to finish before calmly calling him a jerk and hanging up. She blocked him as well, picturing his enraged features with a sense of satisfaction. Noah was the next to call, and while he did not scream, his demanding tone urged her to beg for Isabella's forgiveness. She asked why he hadn't inquired about her reasons before telling him that she was finished with all of them. They had supported her for a few years, but she had donated her bone marrow to save Isabella's life, so her debt was paid in full. Noah told her to stop the nonsense and return home, but she had no desire to continue the argument and discarded her SIM card in a nearby trash can. She obtained a new number at a phone shop. While back in New York at the Harrison residence, the Bennetts began ringing me instead. They claimed Ava had severed all ties, and since everyone knew of my pursuit, they hoped I knew her whereabouts. I eventually succumbed and dialed my roommate, Jake, asking him to check if she was back on campus because I needed to know she was safe. He forwarded a screenshot of a group chat confirming her return, which allowed me to exhale with relief. However, the memory of my cruel words darkened my mood, but I vowed to break my addiction to Ava Bennett or be no better than a pathetic hound. Ava was at a restaurant when she received an iMessage from Olivia regarding my inquiries, to which she simply responded that she was aware. She looked back our old messages and realized how cold she had been, wondering why I had continued to pursue her for so many years. Her thoughts were consumed with remorse as the rising steam from the hot pot fogged the text on her screen. Perspective made her realize how much pain she had caused, and she felt overwhelmed by the chance she had squandered with someone who only had eyes for her. She initiated contact for the first time by telling me she was back, but I chose to ignore the message. The following afternoon, she approached me near the playing fields and called my name, forcing me to pivot and face her. I averted my gaze and asked what was going on, which made her look at the ground in a state of flustered silence. I began to walk away, prompting her to seize my arm and beg me to wait, but I told her to release me. My icy demeanor compounded her social anxiety, and she appeared distraught as she struggled to formulate a response. She eventually whispered that she wished to court me, a statement that left Jake standing there with his jaw agape. I simply scoffed and told her I was not interested before walking off, leaving both of them in a state of shock. Ava returned to her room and collapsed into her chair, where her roommate noted her defeated expression. Ava announced that she intended to pursue someone, and when she named James Harrison, her roommates reacted with total disbelief. Olivia claimed that James was so devoted to her that she only needed to beckon for him to return. Ava flushed and explained that she had deeply offended him and was now desperate to regain his affection. Olivia grew curious about what could have made me disregard her, but she didn't press for details when Ava faltered. The roommates suggested a variety of approaches ranging from sincere apologies to gift-giving or even acting endearing. One even suggested that a simple kiss would solve everything, though they doubted Ava was capable of such a bold move. Ava found their advice unhelpful and eventually headed to the courts on a Friday with a sack of sodas. She recalled that I spent my afternoons there from the countless messages I had sent her in our previous life. The courts were teeming with female spectators who weren't actually watching the sport, but she knew exactly where to find me by the size of the crowd. She remained at the back of the throng and listened to the occasional squeals that burst from the onlookers. She felt an impulse to join in the chanting of my name, but her voice failed her, and she fixed her eyes on her shoes instead. She questioned why I had ever cherished someone so dull and wondered if I would have been happier with a woman who truly worshipped me. Ava could comprehend why I wanted no involvement with her after the way she had treated me in the past. She surveyed the other women who were clearly interested in me and tightened her grip on her bag until it nearly ripped. She questioned if I still harbored any affection for her, and as the clouds gathered and the wind turned cold, she shivered and wished she had brought a coat. A gentle mist descended and caused her to shudder, and while many onlookers fled for shelter, she remained steadfast in the downpour. The match concluded early, and as I left the court with my roommates, several courageous women stepped forward to offer us refreshments. I remained quite sought after even in the rain, yet I declined every offering that came my way. Ava did not advance, but simply observed me from a distance, and while I briefly glanced her way, I ultimately chose to stride directly past her. I kept conversing with my friends without giving her a second look, prompting her to trail behind us in noiseless footsteps. Though courting a man was beyond her comfort zone, she resolved to be brave and eventually caught up to tap me on the shoulder. She extended the sack toward me, but I merely cast a look at her before accepting a beverage from another girl instead. Those 4 cans ultimately wound up back in the dormitory to be consumed by her roommates, and Olivia mocked her for being unable to even give away a soda. While one friend tried to offer comfort, Olivia insisted that Ava should have been more aggressive and simply thrust the bag into my hands. Her friends argued over her introverted nature while Ava simply drank her soda in silence. She began searching online forums for advice on how to win a man, finding that most suggested being bold and brazen. She knew she had the looks but lacked the audacity, so she spent the night reading about assertiveness only to end up more confused than before. She eventually agreed with Olivia that timidity would lead to failure, so she returned to the court the next day with a fresh sack of lemon-lime sodas. Jake had tipped her off about my location, and I was indeed there trying to exhaust my restless energy. I'd been unable to shake the image of her standing in the rain from my mind for several days. Jake pointed her out to me without using her name because he knew how much it irritated me, yet I could not prevent myself from looking. He took advantage of my distraction to score a point, which only fueled my annoyance with both him and myself. I channeled that frustration into the game until Jake finally surrendered and begged for a water break. When we realized no one had brought water, Jake suggested that we simply walk past the spectators and wait for someone to offer me a drink. He clung to my shoulder and insisted that Ava was indeed approaching us, but another girl named Jessica reached me first. Jessica offered me a bottle with a flush of hope, likely assuming I would accept it as I had before. Jessica's gaze felt peculiar, so I remained mute until her arm grew rigid and her smile began to waver. I tracked Ava's hesitation in my peripheral vision while ignoring everything Jessica was saying, and eventually, Ava stepped forward as well. She extended a sack of drinks for me and my friends, but even after she spoke, I simply scrutinized her without making a move to accept the gift. Jake nudged me to respond because he was parched, so I reached out and took the bottle from Jessica instead. Jessica appeared triumphant while Ava's eyes went dull, but she surprised me by thrusting her own bag into my arms before marching away in silence. I remained rooted in astonishment while Ava returned to her room to brood, where her roommates urged her to give up on men and focus on gaming instead. A roommate suggested that she join the athletics committee or the running club to get closer to me, which made Ava realize how little she knew about my life. She obtained the running club schedule and arrived at the meeting point on Sunday afternoon to find only a handful of people gathered there. I appeared a short time later, prompting the president to call the session to order. I was taken aback by her presence, yet I maintained a neutral countenance and began to jog at the rear of the group. Ava promptly aligned her stride behind mine, and after several minutes of silence, I asked her why she was trailing me. She gasped that she was simply running as a member of the club, but I noted that she was already winded and recalled her intense aversion to physical education. Ava recalled how she used to struggle through fitness examinations, while I remembered how I would secretly run beside her to offer encouragement she never noticed. She admitted that while she did not enjoy the sport, she did enjoy my company, a confession that made my heart pound against my ribs. As the run continued, her endurance began to fail and her vision blurred as she neared the point of collapse. I could distinguish her labored exhalations directly at my back, and as a mist began to fall, I suggested we take shelter in a nearby pavilion. Ava attempted to comply, but her lower limbs buckled and she collapsed to the earth, a lingering consequence of the marrow donation she had made as a child. This operation had left her unable to engage in vigorous activity without experiencing vertigo, and she had remained delicate ever since. I registered the impact behind me, but compelled myself to continue forward without glancing back as she struggled to her feet and hastened to the shelter. She slumped onto a bench and closed her eyes to recuperate as the downpour intensified outside. We were the sole occupants of the pavilion, and as I leaned against a post at the far end, I noted her flushed complexion and realized she was utterly spent. I permitted my gaze to rest upon her features until her lashes quivered, prompting me to promptly avert my eyes. Ava observed my distance and resolved to bridge the gap herself, gradually traversing the space to stand beside me. We remained in total silence for an extended duration, a peaceful accord that was entirely foreign to our history of bitterness. I eventually pivoted to face her and asked why she persisted in trailing me, to which she flusteredly repeated her intent to court me. I emitted a derisive chuckle and leaned in to scrutinize her, forcing her to meet my gaze and confirm her feelings. Something in my countenance altered as I seized her chin and pressed her against the timber post, causing her entire frame to quiver with the impact. I bent lower and demanded that she prove her affection by kissing me, but she remained paralyzed with a sense of embarrassment. I scoffed at her reluctance and released her, yet as I began to withdraw, a gentle and hesitant warmth made contact with the corner of my mouth. Our pulses raced in tandem, for it was the inaugural instance across two existences that she had ever initiated such a contact. I endeavored to calm my pulse and drew nearer, indicating that the corner of my mouth did not qualify for what I wanted. Ava dutifully shut her eyes and tilted forward, yet I pressed my digit to her lips to halt her at the last moment. I told her that belated devotion held no value to me before retreating a pace, just as the sunlight finally pierced through the clouds. I pivoted away with an icy facade and ordered her to cease trailing me, leaving her in a state of silent grief. Over the subsequent days, Ava operated like a detached automaton until Olivia intervened to prevent her from drinking scalding water. The abrupt clatter jolted her into awareness, and she finally realized she had been acting entirely without thought. Her roommates urged her to pull herself together and stop fixating on a single man who had rejected her. Despite their encouragement, Ava's inherent tenacity made it impossible for her to surrender her pursuit. That night, she withdrew into her bunk to educate herself on the male psyche through a series of instructional electronic books. She devised a fitness regimen to improve her constitution and began a daily 30-minute jogging routine. She battled her lethargy each morning at 6 to ensure she was out the door and moving at a consistent tempo. While she jogged, she employed the respiration method I had instructed her in years earlier to cope with her previous academic workload. In the past, I had appeared in the darkness to keep her company, instructing her on her pace while we shared light-hearted moments. She was jolted back to the present by the sight of me approaching from the opposite heading, and before she could even formulate a greeting, I dashed past her. Ava continued her jog with a crestfallen countenance, unaware that I had actually peered back over my shoulder as she moved away. I grew frustrated that she made no effort to pursue me, and my thoughts turned toward the bitterness of her past feelings for Ryan. I accelerated my speed until I overtook her once more, and seeing the astonishment in her gaze only inflamed my irritation. Ava misread my grim visage as a foul temper and simply attempted to stay clear of my path. She shifted to an interior lane to afford me greater clearance, which only made me more determined to acknowledge her presence. I veered directly into her course, and we collided, nearly propelling her backward until I seized her arm to stabilize her. As she struggled for air with tearful eyes, I established some separation and inquired why she had crashed into me. Ava was staggered by my brazenness when I blamed her for the collision and suggested that it would not have occurred had she been jogging in the same orientation. I issued an irrational decree that she must trail behind me from now on to prevent further accidents. She silently complied, and the sound of her gentle footfalls at my back immediately elevated my spirits. I eventually recognized that I could no longer detect her presence and found her doubled over with exhaustion. I inquired about her condition while masking my desire to kiss her with a derisive remark about her lack of fitness. Ava clenched her jaw in indignation before asking if I would accompany her to obtain breakfast, to which I ultimately consented. I trailed her toward the cafeteria while my mind wandered back to the countless times I had observed her ponytail swaying in the past. It seemed unfair that she remained so youthful and unchanged while I felt burdened by the memories and wounds of another existence. My resentment intensified as I watched other men admire her, so I accelerated my gait and surged past her in a huff. I resolved not to spend this life merely following her. Yet she interpreted my behavior as a sign that I preferred her to remain behind. We traversed a graveled lane bordered by maples, and I attuned my ears to her footfalls to assess our separation. I stubbornly insisted that it was now her turn to watch my back, yet I eventually succumbed to the urge to peer backward and found her absently nudging at the stones. I felt convinced her affection was a lie because she wasn't constantly gazing at me as I had once done with her. I halted abruptly, causing her to collide with my back once more and recoil with a muted yelp of discomfort. I pivoted to face her, and the sight of her glistening eyes immediately quenched every trace of my bitterness. I advanced toward her and encircled her slender waist, drawing her flush against me despite her reflexive retreat. She stammered in surprise while I reached up to extract a fallen leaf from her hair, leaving her entirely perplexed by my behavior. Fixating on my lips, she recollected her friend's advice and wondered if a kiss would finally pacify my temper. Ava rose onto her toes and initiated a kiss, her frame quivering as she noted the pleasant scent of my soap. Her unexpected action left me electrified until I regained my senses and pressed her against the trunk of a substantial maple tree to hide us from view. The kiss was intense and lasted for 20 minutes before I ultimately drew back to reclaim my breath in the curve of her neck. She remained against the tree in a daze, touching her tender lips and wondering if this was also my first time. Realizing she had missed breakfast and was late for class, she administered a light shove and bid me farewell. I released her and adjusted her collar before watching her depart with a faint smile curving at the corners of my mouth. During her lecture, Ava remained disengaged until her roommate prodded her to respond to the instructor's query. She managed to answer correctly, yet could not hide the flush that arose every time she recalled our morning encounter. Her friend eventually deduced the truth and smirked at Ava's startled countenance, claiming her intuition had been correct all along. Ava spent the day questioning if the kiss signified our reconciliation and grew anxious when I failed to send a message. She eventually requested a meeting at the Ginkgo Grove and waited in the darkness for me to arrive. I eventually appeared and gestured for her to accompany me further into the secluded area, away from the prying eyes of other couples. She followed me into the depths of the grove with her eyes fixed forward to avoid noticing the other couples in the shadows. She asked if the morning kiss was a sign of my affection, but I merely scoffed and asked what man would decline a chance to kiss someone so beautiful. I challenged her to leave if she was dissatisfied with my answer, but after a tense silence, she whispered that she was willing to stay. I sat upright and asked if she truly understood the implications of her agreement, and seeing her serious expression, I pulled her onto my lap. I initiated a kiss that she passively accepted, but when my hand slipped beneath her blouse, she seized my wrist in a panic over our public location. I withdrew immediately and stood up to leave, prompting her to grab my sleeve and demand to know the status of our relationship. I tapped her brow and suggested she could serve as my clandestine girlfriend if she wished to stay near me. She appeared staggered by the insult of being hidden, but she eventually nodded her assent and vowed to make things official eventually. I was stunned by her compliance and decided to establish a set of one-sided regulations to govern our arrangement. I told her she must fulfill every obligation of a girlfriend without expecting me to reciprocate, including a requirement for physical availability. She faltered at the implication, yet seized my arm to accept the terms before I could depart. I hid my grin and added that she must also attend to my daily needs, then requested that she escort me back to my dormitory. When she questioned why she had to walk me home, I reminded her of her station and pinched her cheek. I stopped her at the dormitory entrance to demand a goodbye kiss, which she provided before dashing away. Later that night, she searched for knitting tutorials to make me a gift and promptly agreed to deliver my breakfast the following morning. Ava arrived early to deliver my breakfast and drew the attention of every man exiting the dormitory for their morning lectures. She grew increasingly uneasy as they stared until she finally spotted me emerging with Jake. I accepted the food and ruffled her hair while the onlookers watched in total astonishment. Jake accused me of keeping secrets after witnessing the interaction, but I simply told him that Ava was the one pursuing me. Ava returned to her room and encountered Jessica, the girl who had previously tried to offer me water. Perceiving the other woman's antagonism, Ava chose to disregard her and retreated into her own chamber. Jessica's roommates assured her she had better taste than Ava, while she plotted to catch my attention with a handwritten letter. I discarded the note in a waste bin without reading it, despite Jake's insistence that I should be more appreciative. He asked how I would react if the note had been from Ava, a thought that made me wonder if she only reserved such sentimental gestures for her first love. Jessica persisted in delivering letters to me for 3 days, but I remained entirely indifferent and ordered Jake to discard them. I grew increasingly frustrated that Ava had not messaged me, questioning the validity of her supposed affection. I refused to initiate contact because I feared being hurt again, yet I yearned for her to prove that she genuinely cared. I was tormented by the possibility that she only felt guilty rather than loving, and I remained trapped between my desire for her and my fear of rejection. Ava was oblivious to my inner turmoil because she was struggling with her own exhaustion from a low-paying job. She had been forced to hand out leaflets after her funds ran dry, leading to her collapsing into bed every night in a state of total fatigue. I summoned her to the Ginkgo Grove and waited in the shadows until she arrived, pulling her onto my lap the moment she was near. I kissed her with an intensity that made her gasp for air, and she noted that my mood felt unusually dark. I held her close without speaking, harboring a silent frustration over her lack of communication during the past several days. I whispered her name while she noted that I was wearing the watermelon fragrance from our former life. I grew irritated by her questioning my motives and reminded her of our carnal arrangement to hide my true feelings. She appeared entirely drained and requested to leave, a request that made me question if she was simply desperate to escape my company. I permitted her to depart after seeing her fatigue, and she returned to her dormitory where her roommates expressed concern over her financial situation. Olivia and the others offered her funds and support now that she had severed ties with the Bennetts. She eventually secured a better-paying position at a local tea shop after earning her first few $100s. Her schedule prevented any communication between us, and we remained at a stalemate while she questioned if I was merely exploiting her. I eventually observed her from behind a bookcase in the library and sent a brief message to inquire about her activities. She was startled by the vibration of her device, as she noted that we had not spoken in nearly a week. Ava responded that she was studying, and I eventually seated myself across from her, telling her that I desired a kiss. She initially refused due to her heavy workload, yet I persisted until her ears flushed with embarrassment. I coaxed her for just a single moment of intimacy, while she questioned if this was the only reason I sought her company. I initiated a brief kiss that left her cheeks burning with impact while she cast a furtive glare my way. She returned to her assignments without realizing our interaction had been photographed and posted online. Her roommate later informed her that the image was circulating on a campus confessions page and that the student body was already disparaging her character. Ava was mortified by the high-definition photograph of our kiss and wondered why my gaze appeared so full of sentiment. She retreated into her bunk to hide from the world while she examined the online comments about her behavior. While scrolling through the feed, her vision locked upon another post that was directed toward me from a different source. She discovered that Jessica had been posting daily confessions addressed to me, a realization that prompted her to examine the vitriol in her own comment thread. She eventually sent me a screenshot of the criticism and suggested we exercise greater caution regarding our public displays. Jake showed me the same post while we were in the cafeteria, offering a lascivious grin at the speed of my progress. I secretly preserved the image while publicly feigning indifference, yet the situation grew dire as the online chatter turned into malicious slander. I eventually discovered that Jessica and Isabella were the ones orchestrating the character assassination through anonymous accounts. I employed my family's influence to erase every trace of the rumors and warned Jessica to desist, but I had failed to anticipate the depth of Isabella's derangement. My blood turned to ice when I received an image of Ava bound to a chair with a demand for me to arrive at a derelict warehouse alone. The spectral memories of our deaths threatened to overwhelm me, but I steeled my heart and coordinated with my father and the authorities to secure the location. I transmitted a final message to Ava's disposable phone, instructing her to stall for time while help was on the way. I had faith in Ava's newfound fortitude as I entered the warehouse and confronted Isabella alongside her menacing accomplices. Isabella mocked my devotion while I observed Ava's subtle signal toward an oil drum position behind her. I attempted to draw their attention while Isabella brandished a detonator and shrieked that it was too late for either of us. Isabella vowed that Ava would perish because of me, but I simply regarded her with pity before Ava executed her maneuver. She toppled the drum to create a slick of motor oil that incapacitated one ruffian, allowing me to overpower the other. The authorities swarmed the building and neutralized the detonator before Isabella could cause any harm. I released Ava from her bindings and held her tight while she quivered with the lingering terror of the encounter. Later, in the hospital, I watched her pare an apple in silence before deciding to dismantle the barricade I had built around my heart. I extracted the list of regulations from my billfold and asked if her devotion was born of genuine love or merely a sense of remorse. I confessed that I had used the list to safeguard myself from further suffering, and I shredded the document before her eyes to signify our fresh start. She murmured my name with tearful eyes while I cradled her visage and kissed her with total reverence. This moment held no traces of the past, only the priceless sensation of reclaiming a love that was once lost and a determination to never relinquish it again. I retracted my previous statement regarding the timing of her affection and formally inquired if I could court her in this life. She responded with a radiant smile and a conviction that signaled the healing of our past wounds. As the sunlight enveloped us, I realized that our new future together was only just beginning. In that moment when I tore the list to shreds, I was finally releasing my fear of being wounded all over again. In matters of the heart, we often raise walls of ice because we dread reliving past anguish, forgetting that while those barriers shield us, they also shut out any warmth. Life offers no rewrites, so do not allow your pride to cut down the one who sees only you. True redemption lies not in erasing yesterday, but in treasuring today. If existence could truly be restarted, would you steer clear of the one who once broke you? Or would you, just as they did, even with the knowledge of coming pain, still race back toward each other?